This is a production of Cornell University.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for accommodating me to participate virtually and to wrap up this. Seems like a very rapid fire session, a lot of information happening really fast. I'm going to talk very quickly and hopefully stay on time about the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act and what the state is doing in implementation. So just a very quick overview, because I know we don't have a ton of time on the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. It was passed in 2019, so it's a veteran law nowadays. It set us up for emissions reductions requirements, 85% below 1990 levels by 2050, with an interim target of 40% by 2030. And we have a lot of clean energy and energy efficiency requirements that are now part of that law that we are marching steadily towards achieving. And there's also very strong requirements around climate justice and just transition included in that law. The Climate Act requires New York State to look at our emissions differently than other jurisdictions or how we had even done it in the past. It requires us to look at the upstream out-of-state emissions related to fossil fuels that come into our state and are combusted for end uses. And it also requires us to use a 20-year global warming potential versus a 100-year global warming potential, which is all how different gases persist in the atmosphere relative to carbon dioxide, which is typically the benchmark greenhouse gas. The result of all of this was a bit of a shift in terms of the magnitude each sector contributes to our statewide emissions, with buildings and transportation taking up more than half, and our electricity sector being what was a relatively smaller contributor in terms of percentage, and our waste sector being a larger percentage, which is most related to the use of methane, use of natural gas or methane from landfills, and the global warming potential of methane. You'll also see these bar charts showing the aggressive step down that we need to realize in order to achieve the requirements of the Act, where we were in 1990, where we are in 2021, which is our most recent year of data, and where we need to be 2030 and 2050. The Climate Act created a Climate Action Council whose job it was to create a plan on how we're going to achieve those emissions reductions. And the council worked for 2 years on a draft. Draft was published and went out for public comment. We got thousands and thousands and thousands of comments. It was also a large analytical body of work was undertaken to look at the costs and benefits of the actions within the plan. And that plan was finalized at the end of 2022. And every 5 years, we have to refresh that plan. So now we are deep in the implementation section. One of the larger components of the scoping plan was a recommendation that New York State go forth with a cap and invest program. So this is a large economy-wide program that sets emissions reductions targets, the requirements, and also brings in revenue in order to reinvest in the economy and emissions reductions technologies. So Governor Hochul, off the bat, recommended in 2023 State of the State that the agencies get to work on developing this program. And then again in 2024, when the state budget advanced a structure in terms of how the proceeds, we would structure the investment of the proceeds from the program. So very briefly, how the cap and invest program works. There is an annual limit on the amount of greenhouse gases statewide that can be emitted. It's not a sector-specific cap, but it's a statewide blanket cap for the year. The greenhouse gas emission sources or sources of fuel for heating or for transportation are required to obtain allowances at auction for the emissions associated with their activities. So those auctions, the proceeds from those allowances are then reinvested into the economy, into technologies that reduce emissions to minimize costs and supporting this great transition that the state is undertaking in terms of building decarbonization and electric sector decarbonization and transportation decarbonization. And the program prioritizes frontline disadvantaged communities The Climate Act all throughout has a large focus on ensuring that the transition to a clean energy economy and the reductions of greenhouse gas emissions prioritizes disadvantaged communities. The governor also set forth principles that guide the development of this Cap and Invest program. The agencies are structured within these principles of affordability, ensuring that this program is affordable for New Yorkers, that we are demonstrating climate leadership regionally, nationally, that it creates jobs and preserves competitiveness of the New York State economy. Again, that the prioritization of investment in disadvantaged communities is always front and center, and that these funds are being invested in a sustainable future for the state of New York. So this, as I mentioned, this process has been in place, the development of these regulations. This is not a small undertaking. It's quite a large program to develop. And there has been a transparent and public process over the past year and a half, 2 years on the development of the draft regulations. So we kicked off a process of putting out to the public, what has been done in other jurisdictions. California and Washington and the province of Quebec have similar programs in place, looking at what they have done, what works in New York, what doesn't work in New York, and receiving all this feedback, having technical webinars to gain insight, conducting learning sessions, putting out some preliminary analytical work to help ground some of the discussion, having direct roundtable discussions with equity stakeholders and labor stakeholders. And all of that has been going on, and there's been a public intake process to receive input to help craft those regulations in a way that's going to work well for New York. As I mentioned, in the 2024 state budget, the governor set forth the structure for the investment, where the proceeds will be directed. It's a high-level breakdown where that budget created what's called a consumer climate action account. So 30% of proceeds from those auctions of allowances will go directly back to New Yorkers. They'll flow through the climate action account and they'll go back to New Yorkers. And also was a direction to proceed with an affordability study whose outcome was to see what's the best mechanism by which to deliver those proceeds back to New Yorkers to help reduce their costs. There was also an industrial small business climate action account that was set aside 3% of future proceeds to mitigate costs for that sector. And then the remaining goes into a climate investment account, which supports the transition. So that's a large portion of the funding that goes into all sorts of clean energy program, clean transportation, community support, large variety of different activities. So some highlighted projected effects of the New York Cap and Invest program. So when we look at currently enacted policies, and there's a lot of modeling going on to understand what are the costs, what are the benefits of the program, what are the right cost triggers in order to see certain emissions reductions. There's a high body of analytical work out there. But we do see that this program accelerates our progress towards meeting our emission limits. So it will achieve pretty significant greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but we're also going to need a lot of other current and new programs to complement the Cap and Invest program, because our emissions reductions requirements in the state of New York are very, very aggressive. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions improves air quality. There's health benefits that are outcomes of those that are benefits for all regions of the state, but they tend to provide greater benefits in disadvantaged communities that have traditionally been more burdened by poor air quality. So the program is expected to generate large volumes of money to support the clean energy transition and to support program affordability. And that's important because we have there's a lot that needs to happen. There was just a recent discussion around heat pumps in manufactured homes. In order to achieve building decarbonization, there's going to need to be a lot of heat pumps installed in lots of homes across the state of New York to transition us off of fossil fuels for home heating and cooling via the electric system. Then the affordability benefit payment, along with these investments, are modeled to really manage household costs, and they're really directed towards managing greater costs for low-income households. So low-income households will be, under the modeling scenarios, better off under a cap and invest program. So as I mentioned, the equity considerations are, a huge part of the Climate Act and New York's work in greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So the Climate Act requires that the Department of Environmental Conservation, and I guess I never took a second to introduce myself, but I'm Maureen Leddy. I'm the Director of the Office of Climate Change at the Department of Environmental Conservation. That everything that we do in terms of regulations to implement the Climate Act do not result in an increase in co-pollutant emissions or disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. It requires that our actions prioritize reductions in disadvantaged communities, and like every state agency and authority and so on, at least 35% with a goal of 40% of our investment will directly benefit disadvantaged communities. So as I mentioned, there's been a lot of information shared publicly. It's all on the Cap and Invest website. A pre-proposal outline created a lot of points to consider in terms of how we can address impacts in disadvantaged communities, either within or complementary to the New York Cap and Invest program. So NYCE does not allow offsets. So a lot of other Cap and Invest programs allow obligated entities to comply by purchasing offsets, and that's as proposed under our current public information, not to be a component of the program for Cap and Invest. And that's an important consideration for equity stakeholders because they want to see those reductions happen. They don't want to see offsets happen. So here's a quick snapshot timeline of where we are in this large process. So the top bar blue is the regulation development. There's 3 regulations that make up the program. One is a greenhouse gas reporting rule. That's how we get the information on how much emissions is occurring. The next is the cap and invest rule, which sets the cap and how the cap declines over time. It sets who is an obligated entity and lots of other considerations around the structure and function of the program. And the third rule is the auction rule, and that sets out the framework and the procedures under which the auctions of allowances occur. So we have put out a lot of initial information and have been receiving feedback from the public and stakeholders for a really long time now, and we are in this right at the cusp of being ready to issue the regulatory proposal. So we're very hopeful that will happen very soon. And then that will kick off a formal comment period and hearings. And we anticipate there being a lot of interest and a lot of feedback and a lot of comment received over the coming months and years on how the program should look. And then we issue final regulations, the reporting program begins, the data intake occurs, and compliance begins. In green, we have the timeline for the work around investments. So there's been a draft framework for the investments posted publicly, also on the Cap and Invest website. We're receiving public input. To be clear, agencies are not in charge of deciding where the investments go. It'll all be decided through the legislative and budget process. But we do want to have a framework and a decision point that's informed by public information, by public feedback on what are the investments that are important to New Yorkers, like how much should go to transportation, how much should go to buildings in large share like that. So all that information is also available, and comment is being accepted on that too. And then our intention is to develop an investment proposal that we submit to the governor so that she can incorporate that into her 2025 budget process, because as I mentioned, then this all goes on to negotiation with the legislature as part of finalizing the state budget. And hopefully we want to set forward a long-term planning horizon. So NYCE investments have some certainty over a rolling 5-year, whatever, multi-year planning process. So there's a runway for us to work within. So as I mentioned, the Cap and Invest program is big. It's a large part of what the state is doing, but there's also a lot of other policies and regulations underneath that large umbrella program that are all necessary and important to helping us achieve the emissions reductions of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And here is my last slide here with all the websites and email addresses and all that good stuff. So you can find all this great information. It's a lot, right? Like this is a lot of information. It's a really big program, but we have posted everything that we have that's available up on the web. You can see all the comments that have been received. They're all available publicly on the web. You want to provide feedback, there's an online form at capitinvest.ny.gov where you can submit your feedback electronically. You can email this email address, or you can send it is the regular U.S. Postal Service mail to DEC's Air Quality Planning Division. So with that, I think maybe I'm in good on time, and I'll pass the mic back to Jenny, I suppose.
Thank you, Maureen. That was fantastic. All right, thank you so much. I think that is, does anybody have any questions for Maureen before we lose her? What is your biggest hope for Cap and Invest for facilitating both greenhouse gas mitigation and equity at the same time?
That's a really great question. I mean, we want to ensure, we feel like there's a good body of evidence that demonstrates that the emissions reductions benefit the entire state of New York, but they are definitely higher in disadvantaged communities. But we also hear from disadvantaged communities the desire for a lot of certainty. They really want to know this is going to happen, and modeling is modeling, right? So there's a lot of other parallel work that we are not losing sight of to ensure that those reductions will happen in those communities and that they will realize those benefits. You know, we have other requirements under the law that moderate our permitting, not just DEC, but all agencies are any administrative decisions that are required to, to consider disadvantaged communities, to put those front and center. So there's all sorts of other mechanisms in place that we want to use as much as possible, complementary to NICI, to make sure that happens.
Okay, I just want to say thank you for the huge, huge, huge amount of work throughout this whole process. I think it's kind of amazing what you all are convening. It's just amazing. So
thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay. All right. Well, everybody, go to the Energy Expo tomorrow and see these things, these materials firsthand. And I will also just say, I would really like to say thanks to Josh, John, Ken, and Gabriel, who've been this massive team of people working on the Energy Expo and this panel. And also thank you to Danielle with your work on manufactured housing. With that, we are done with this session. Thank you so much for coming.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.